Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbender.online.com. This is going to be episode 207 of the podcast, episode 207 of our regular shows. We've got lots more that are just reviews and stuff like that, but yeah, I'm going to be your main host for this one, Morgan Airspeed Prime, and joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's show, we're going to go through a bunch of the news that we have to cover since the last Avatar podcast we did, which was a while ago because Christmas and stuff like that happened. And then our main topic this time out is going to be continuing what we said we do pretty much on the last one, which is our kind of going back through the Avatar comic series by series, and we're going to be reviewing The Search today once again. So yeah, we'll just jump straight into the news. It's going to be completely out of order in terms of when it happened and stuff like that, just trying to get through it. The first one that comes to mind for me is the sort of leaked reveal of Legend of Korra Funko Pops. We've seen no pictures of any of them. All we know right now is that they've sort of popped up, names have popped up in database listings, which was sort of the same way we found out about which exact figures were going to be done in the Avatar ones. And this, with Funkos in general, tends to be the way you find out about most of them. So I think we have 4 confirmed so far. We're going to be getting Korra, Asami, Mako, and Amon. I don't think that's everything. Everyone is very concerned, where's Bolin, where's other characters and stuff like that. And I think the fact that there's been no exclusives or anything like that shown off tells you that there's still more to be announced. But this was a really nice kind of surprise to see this happen. I'm almost surprised we haven't heard about Wave 2 of the Avatar ones yet. But Greg, what are your thoughts on Korra Funko Pops confirmed?
Yeah, I think that's definitely really cool that we sort of just figured out about, more of these coming out. I think it's definitely a good addition to have them there after we've had the sort of initial Avatar wave of them. So I think it's really cool. I think it's interesting that we don't have the full listing, but since this is sort of like a sneak early preview that someone just sort of got the information on, I'm not surprised that it's not the full sort of listing of everything that we're getting, especially like you mentioned with any of the specific store exclusives or however other type of exclusives that they typically do. So it should be cool to sort of find out the full sort of listing of them. And I don't know, I guess I'm interested to see how they do the designs of the core ones like they did with the original ones. So that should be interesting to see, since these are, I don't know, I think it's, they either work or they don't work for you, but I think they're still pretty cool just to sort of have there in the market regardless.
Yeah, there's definitely loads of core characters that they should have in the first wave. Tenzin, Lin, Tarlok, and then in terms of exclusives, you have so many options with the amount of character, the amount of outfits that Korra wears, especially in book 1. You could do so many. Pro bending, I think that seems like a 3-pack, Fire Ferret 3-pack of them all their pro bending gear. Air Kids and stuff like that. There's probably almost more options for Korra than there are for Avatar if you really kind of break it down. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see just how many they do and what's an exclusive here or there. Do they do Pabu, Naga, that sort of stuff. But next up is a sort of surprise reveal from Dark Horse, which was just an announcement sort of came out of the blue. Avatar The Last Airbender, The Promise Omnibus Edition. Now, we don't have the full details on this yet because the press release states that there will be a new cover for this that will be revealed soon, and it's been about a month and a bit since that, so I suppose we're expecting the new cover anytime soon. But effectively what this is, it is just a very basic collection of The Promise. It's same size as a individual part of a comic. It's just the 3 books in one, so it's a thicker book. Basically, it's the same size as the Lost Adventures, kind of almost 200-ish pages at that size. None of the extras are going to be included here, so no annotations or art extras at the back. Just the 3 books for a cheaper price. It's coming out June 30th, 2020. And the price is $24.99, so you save about $7-8 compared to buying just the 3 parts at like full price, which of course is much cheaper than the library edition. So I think this is a very good idea to, I assume what they're going to do is reprint all of the books as an omnibus edition to get just cheaper collected editions out there. And the fact that they seem to be going for new covers for all of them is very interesting to me. I hope this means we're getting a new Team Guru cover, because I'd love to see more art from them, and see what a different approach to like a library edition style cover for The Promise is going to be. But who knows? They could get a new artist on to do it. I'm not really sure. But what are your thoughts on this as a new sort of product kind of type thing that Dark Horse is doing?
I don't know, I think it's interesting. I mean, whenever they have another collection for stuff, I think it's nice, just another way to sort of get it into people's hands. And I think, after the fact of having, the originals come out, I think if you haven't gotten them and you want them sort of as a collected sort of, piece that's sort of, I guess, a bit more sort of manageable, then I think it definitely works for that. I think it's cool that we're going to get new artwork. I wonder, like you mentioned, are we going to get new Team Guru artwork, or for the later other ones, if they get to like the core for the artists that did those ones as well. So I don't know. I think it's definitely cool to see. It's not something. I mean, it's a normal sort of like comic thing, but I don't know. I don't know if I really thought that they would do it for the Avatar ones the way that they have sort of been releasing them, and sort of like I guess just the general sort of like information that we get about them is sort of like piecemeal. So it's definitely a welcome, I guess, sort of surprise in general.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing in the press release for this was that they were really sort of emphasizing the 15-year anniversary of Avatar, which is this year, of course. So that's why I think everyone's sort of getting a bit hyped for like when Dark Horse finally announced their sort of 2020 Avatar stuff. There might be some really big stuff happening in that. We're going to be expecting now The Search Omnibus edition, given what we're going to be talking about later on, and so on. And yeah, these new covers are going to be exciting, and it's just going to... These are kind of, I think, going to become the sort of go-tos in terms of recommending like how to get physical copies of the books to everyone, just because the library editions aren't for everyone. They're a little kind of maybe big and stuff like that for kind of, I think, a lot of people to just buy all of them unless you're a collector. So these seem like the perfect way to just have a copy of the book. And especially with the new cover, I don't mind getting like my third time buying these comic series if it's got a nice new cover on it. Especially for The Promise, which I really like, as we talked about in like the last main podcast. Next topic is the Avatar: The Last Airbender Steelbook Edition Blu-ray collection. So this was a kind of exciting thing when it was announced, and then I think it immediately sort of calmed down once everyone sort of read through what it actually was. It's just a re-release of the same Blu-ray that we got, except it's in fancier packaging, in that like it's steelbook, of course, so it's going to be 3 steelbooks in a sort of, I suppose, rigid case for the 3 steelbooks. The steelbooks are going to have nice art on both sides. One side of each of the 3 is going to be put together to make an overall sort of mural type thing, and then if you flip them around, the other side is art that features more specific art to that book. Again, really nicely done. They got a new artist on board. I think they said like hand-picked by Brian and so on. So they're really nice steel books, but that's the only like new thing about it. It's just fancy packaging, and they're saying it's like limited to however many, I don't remember the exact number it was. But the problem with this is that like it's on I think the retail price is $98, but like I think it's actually on sale on Amazon for like $88. But that's still like 3-4 times the price of what the standard Blu-ray is now, and that just seems like far too much just for nice packaging. I think we recently got revealed that it does come with like an excerpt booklet from The Rise of Kyoshi, but wow, you get 20 pages of a book that's been out for a while now. That doesn't seem that great. In that, like, even if they included just a copy of The Rise of Kyoshi, it still would be a little bit much of an asking price. So what are your thoughts on this Steelbook collection being announced?
Yeah, no, I think I fall in line with that. I remember when it was sort of announced, and the artist, and I followed the artist directly, so that was cool to see. So it seemed like it had like a good bit of hype behind it, but yeah, it's just sort of what we've seen before, just in sort of like a steel case, which is just like a nicer sort of presentation thing if you want to sort of have it up somewhere. I was looking at some other ones just to see sort of what it really was, because I didn't really get what it was to begin with, honestly. So no, I mean, I think it's cool that they're doing this for the anniversary, and I think it's definitely a nice thing to have if you happen to not have it and you want this more as like sort of like a show off piece, since that's really what you would really sort of get it for. But yeah, the price is quite high. I mean, Blu-rays, I guess, more expensive regardless, but I don't know, that seems like a really high price for this sort of thing, but I guess it is limited, so it'll be like your only time to sort of get it. So I don't know, I think it's cool, but it's not something that I would particularly get.
Yeah, like this needed to have like new extras on the sets or something like that. Especially if this is also meant to be like a 15-year anniversary thing.
Mm.
It was always like a problem with the original Blu-ray set that there was no in any way modern like feature on the sets of like reflecting that like the series is over 10 years old or at the time or whatever. Like even just a new interview with Mike and Brian talking about it or something like that would have been so much better, but there was just nothing. So yeah, this had a lot of excitement behind it, then it didn't, and now it's just kind of somewhere in the middle. We'll see what happens. I think it's out in just a few weeks as well, so I think it's meant to sort of coincide with the actual anniversary date. But yeah, I'm not sure how much excitement there's exactly going to be on this.
Yeah.
The next thing is Dark Horse, specifically Rachel Roberts, who's the editor for the Avatar books, but she does other projects as well for Dark Horse, so it's not. This news isn't specifically like 100% confirmed to be about Avatar or Korra, but she sort of teased this idea that she's like working on a new Avatar book or something like that, and based on what she'd been posting about like previously, it doesn't seem to be what it would obviously be, in that like, oh, it must be the Promise Omnibus edition, because she'd posted a few pictures of like clearly editing that book together. But it doesn't really fit with like the timeline, the idea that like she just got in like advanced copies of that book. So unless it's some brand new book, and she specifically said like it hadn't been announced yet even, it's like, what is that? And like the speculation is like, oh, is it the new Avatar comic that hasn't been announced, new Korra comic that hasn't been announced, or like Runes of the Empire Library edition or something like that? Or is it just not Avatar related at all? Do you have any thoughts on this? Any speculation on this?
Yeah, no, I remember seeing this and checking out the tweet and stuff, and I don't know, I mean, it could really go any sort of way. I mean, I think just because we know that they have sort of worked on it before, that we see that, this has a higher chance than normal, being something Avatar related, but I don't know, the way that they sort of release information is sort of, I don't know, it's interesting, because sometimes it'll be sort of like on the individual letter way of doing things, and then other ways is just sort of they'll do like sort of a bigger sort of announcement type thing. So I don't know, I mean, I think it's definitely it's worth checking out and keeping in mind, just because it has a high chance of something, but it really could be sort of anything as far as I can see right now.
Mm-hmm. And then next thing, I suppose, is just kind of surprising thing that happened to me is just that Insight Editions, the publisher of the journals, the Avatar Korra journals, and then the Avatar Legacy, Avatar Chronicles, and the new Legacy of the Fire Nation, kind of contacted me out of the blue, asking if I wanted a review copy for the new book. I said yes, and then like I think like a week later it arrived. So like I had this book like nearly 3 months before release. So yeah, I've read and reviewed already, at least an early review, Legacy of the Fire Nation, the third one of those sort of journal-style books. And in terms of like, I don't want to spoil the whole thing, but I suppose by now you've probably seen a decent amount of images from it, because like I think Korra News, who's another kind of
Yeah.
account that posts news, posted a bunch of pictures from it as well. I think the best thing to say about the book is that it is a huge improvement over the previous two books, and that it's definitely the best of the three. it's still not quite what I think the series needs to be necessarily in terms of it probably should have more information than it has. But this one is more thought provoking. It says a little bit more than I expected it to, and then the art is actually very interesting because Sora Medina actually, draws some stuff that we've been waiting for, of like older versions of the characters doing different things. Like that always gets people excited because we know so little about it. And then just throughout the book, you have little bits and pieces like on the Fire Nation royal family tree. There's like Key as a teenager. That's an interesting kind of look. Here's like Rina and Jinzuk, Ursa's parents, when they were younger. Things like that, I think, really add some kind of layers to it. The pullouts are much better than they were in an Avatar's Chronicle, and just I think overall it's a much more interesting book, and I think it's really helped by the fact that it's written in universe from Iroh's perspective. So even if he's just rambling about stuff, it's kind of interesting rambling. Whereas, like, say, Korra narrating the last book was just a direct recap of the series. So that's probably the best thing to say about it. And then closer to the release of the book, I'm actually going to do like a proper in-depth review. And I think there might be actually some worth to kind of discussing, analyzing some of it, because there's a few hints and teases about some of the kind of bigger questions about Iroh that we've had without going overly in depth. But Greg, how much of the kind of promo stuff in the lead up to this book's release have you seen?
Yeah, I've seen a good bit of it. At least when it was initially sort of thing. I think that was like sometime near the end of last year or whatever. But no, I mean, from what I remember seeing, it definitely seemed like this book had, at least image-wise, it had a lot more sort of going for it than any of the previous ones, and especially with what you're sort of saying in your other talks about it. It definitely seems like this is one that is definitely more interested than all the previous ones, and actually has something that's, worth actually sort of talking about, because the previous ones, I mean, there was like a couple things that I could think of that were sort of interesting, but overall there wasn't much, as far as story-wise, which is, the thing that we're always sort of, looking for information, or even just, purely from like sort of like a visual standpoint, I think would be really good. I mean, these books, they're not sort of novels, they're not, comics, so it's not, I guess it might be too much to be thinking and hoping for any sort of like, real information, considering, I don't know, the process for how to go through, if they're, sort of going through Bright and having all that, which we know they usually are sort of involved with most things to some degree, but, as far as story-wise, it wouldn't be, on the level of something like, Rise of Kyoshi or something, along those lines, or the comics or anything. But it's definitely cool to hear that there's more to it. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more of the art and stuff. And like, this would be one that like, I would actually consider getting like a digital copy of it, or, even just actually going to check them out, myself.
Mm. Yeah, like of the three books like this one is definitely the one I'd be like, yeah, this one's much more worth getting, just because a lot of the art is actually very, very unique and interesting, in that like one of the pages features like young Azulon, like it looks like a 10-year-old Azulon, like that's just this crazy thing we never ever thought that we'd see. It's just like that character at that age, but it's included here, and it's pretty interesting. Final piece of news is just sort of the ongoing sort of saga of misinformation about the Diamond Select Avatar figures. I know for a lot of people this won't matter. It's just, the figures are the figures. But like if you're like me, kind of trying to cover news about these things and get like the accurate information out there about what is the situation with regards to the Walgreens exclusives, the standard versions, what accessories you get with what, and it's just been like misinformation after misinformation after misinformation. And I just thought it was all over the place, in that initially my impression was that the Walgreens exclusive was just literally that it's the same figure but being sold early. Then they later confirmed that actually the Walgreens exclusive has less accessories and is also being sold early, but that the main version is going to have more accessories and better articulation. Then it came out that like, oh, actually, sorry about this, but the Walgreens exclusive version now has exclusive accessories. So the accessories are different. You don't get the Walgreens accessories in the regular versions. And I think when they mentioned that, I just kind of like did a kind of, what is it, retweet with comment. It was just saying like, does anyone agree with me that they've been terrible about misinformation on this? And Diamond Select on Twitter actually replied and said, yeah, sorry about this. We know we haven't been the most clear about it. We'll try to be better in the future. So at least in the end, I think they kind of apologized and realized it was a bit of a mess the entire time about accessories and so on. But I think the figures are out right now, at least if you got them in comic book stores. But I think they're basically still being released over the next couple of months into like specialist stores and so on. So we still don't have tons of like information and so on. You probably haven't seen much coverage about them, but there's been a few extra pictures and so on. I still feel like I don't know everything about them, and that like I don't know if Zuko actually comes with his swords or not. It seems like he doesn't, so those accessories just don't exist on any figure potentially. I'm not really sure. But how closely, if at all, have you followed the kind of information on the action figures?
Yeah, I've seen some of the news about, sort of which accessories come with which version and will come out with the store versus like the sort of mass market version of it. Yeah, no, I mean, from someone who's not even paying super amount of attention to it, it just seems like they're not really clear on what's sort of coming out where and sort of how to sort of like, I don't know, I guess just get the information out. Because I mean, I remember when we got like some, finally got some better sort of images of everything, and it seemed like, they had it sort of locked down on, what was coming out with who. But now it definitely seems like that's not the case anymore. So yeah, no, I'll probably just be one of those people to wait to see what actually comes out where and see what people sort of see when they actually sort of get into their hands, since right now it definitely seems like it's sort of up in the air still.
Yeah, it's just been messy. Like myself, like actually trying to follow it exactly and like do videos and stuff like that. It's been very, very unclear on that. I think the fact that they kind of apologize for it kind of says everything that you need to know. Because it's like you don't want it to be that awkward about specific things. Like the main, I think, concern at this point is mainly just like, I think with Aang mainly, that if you want Momo to come with Aang, you have to get the sort of mass market version. But if you want Aang with his staff, you have to get the Walgreens version, because the staff isn't included in the mass market version for some reason. And then like it makes the Zuko figure seem very, very weird that it seems like he doesn't come with his swords in either version, and the only difference is that like he comes with a small fire effect part in the Walgreens version, and then a big fire effect part for the uh, mass market version, and like that's the only accessory. The only difference is like clear stand, black stand, and then big fire, small fire. It's just very weird to me what's going on. Um, but yeah, I think that's most of the news. The only other thing to add to that is just in terms of news we're waiting for, news we're expecting, is that we know there's a new Avatar comic coming. We're still waiting for like the cover for the Promise Omnibus, to get the Avatar comic announced, to get the next Korra comic announced, to get the Korra the Runes of the Empire Library Edition announced. Plus, we still don't have the cover for Shadow of Kyoshi. So there's all this sort of news that kind of should be coming out any time now, that everyone is sort of waiting for. So, Greg, what are your thoughts on when do you think we're going to see some of these announcements made? Because come a month from now, we'll have our last announced like new story content done in terms of like Runes of the Empire Part 3 will have released, and we don't know about any new comic after that.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, I would think that they would do it around the time that that's released, just because to sort of keep sort of like the information going, keep some of the hype up for, just sort of Avatar, items in general. But I don't know. I haven't really, other than, that, the one random sort of tweet about something that may or may not even have anything to do with Avatar. There doesn't seem like there's much story content wise that's sort of coming out that's really sort of going to push things forward. I mean, from all intents and purposes, like you said, we know that they are coming out with something, but I don't know. I mean, I would think they would do it sometime during Q1, which would be, around now, unless they're going to do it near sort of the end of it. So I don't know. I'm not really sure. I don't know. I'm sure there's like a ton of like behind the scenes things going on, and they're trying to get things probably lined up for like, like the whole sort of year. But as people that sort of follow it and sort of waiting for stuff, it doesn't seem like they're not really telling us much right now.
Yeah, I'm assuming that they won't wait longer than the 15-year anniversary, which is like what, February 21st, I think it is, or something
Hmm.
like that. So that's the date that we're sort of looking towards, because that's basically in or around when Runes of the Empire Part 3 is released, at which point we only have like Imbalanced Library Edition is like the only other book they have like that's announced, in addition to the Promise Omnibus, so just kind of reprint books. We're still waiting on all that new content, basically. Um, but yeah, we're waiting for news, but we'll move into our main topic for this podcast, which is our re-review, our kind of look back at the Search comic. So, the Search is the second in the series of Avatar comic trilogies, and it was definitely a very hyped comic because we went from the Promise, which was this, I think we both feel, very strong start, into the story kind of everyone wanted them to tell. Um, and for me, I don't think any of the comics that have happened since then have come particularly close to matching this, and that, like, I think the Search is far and away like the best Avatar comic we've had so far, because of like sheer importance of content, but also it has, like, I think some of the best character writing, drama, like reveals and stuff like that. And we're kind of basically just waiting for our next book like The Search, effectively. So I suppose, what are your just before we get into the details, what are your general thoughts on The Search?
Yeah, no, I think you have a really good point there as far as this probably being one of the best, if not the best to most people at least, Avatar sort of comic that we have to date. I think, having the importance, the sort of, feeling of tying up a loose end from, the actual, show, I think definitely sort of like elevated it to sort of like a higher sort of level that we've seen with most of the comics so far, which I guess is sort of like an unfair advantage that it has overall. But I think that really it really sort of sets the stage for what the comics sort of can be if they're really tied down into the world and something that we sort of have a basis for, which I mean doesn't mean that it can't be a new story with these characters can't be sort of developed that can be on the same sort of level. But I think the way that the story flows between these three books, it has a sort of resonance with it, with just fans in general, and just with the story beats that they're sort of trying to accomplish. And it's not like it's fully resolved by the end of these three books. There's still a lot of stuff that's sort of up in the air that is touched again on later books. But even still to this day, there's some plot lines from this book that we're still sort of waiting to sort of find out. So there's definitely more that can be told with this story that might be something that a lot of people would be interested on finding. But yeah, no, I think overall this is definitely one of the best ones, if not the best sort of series of books that we've gotten so far.
Yeah, and I think why it's so good is that this book, like, could have been, I think it was always going to have like excitement and be one of the better books, but like I think it could have
Hmm.
been lesser than kind of what it is, by just focusing in too much on like keeping Ursa, holding her back until the end. And that's why it was such a surprise, and a pleasant surprise, that the book basically opens up by announcing to you that Zuko and Ursa find each other again. That, like, it takes until the very end for it to be like 100% confirmed that that opening panel, black with just the 2 lines of text, it means what you think it means. But I think that's so well done in that it immediately opens that door, and within like the first 10, 15 pages, we're getting full Ursa backstory here. Like, we're not just going to be Aang, Zuko, Katara, and Azula just searching, and it's going to be 3 books of like the group traveling together, journeying. Like, at least a third of these 3 books is just Ursa backstory, flashback to her when she was younger, getting married to Ozai with the kids, her banishment, and so on. It's Ursa's perspective, and she really, I think, in this book kind of transforms from being just Zuko's mom into being like Ursa the character. And I think that's the biggest success of this book, is it took a relatively underdeveloped character, but who held importance to one of the fan favorite characters in Zuko, into actually being a like truly interesting character on her own. So what are your thoughts on just that, this book's approach to Ursa, like such a mysterious character, the tease from the end of the show, and how they approached tackling it in this comic series?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely something that I was going to bring up. Is just that's one of the strengths of the book. I think that's something that we sort of mention, later on, as far as, wanting to find out more of the sort of backstory, having, a bit more sort of flashbacks to sort of, flesh out things from characters that we don't really, know too much about. And, like you mentioned, this book, over the course of these 3 books, whenever the book, switches the tone of the sort of pages to sort of that, sort of old sort of sepia type of look, it's a backstory about, Ursa and getting her perspective on things, either, her initial sort of relationship to then switching to Ozai, to then sort of like even, slightly more recent sort of backstory with everything with the Mother of Faces and how, that whole thing went down. And then even when you find her as, a character who doesn't, remember who she really is after she visits the Mother of Faces, you're still getting, an additional sort of perspective on her character, how she acts now. And, I think that definitely, it helps flesh out her character, since it's someone that we don't really know, pretty much anything about, as far as, how she actually acts as sort of like her own individual person. We just know her sort of via sort of like, just via sort of Zuko, and sort of always talking about sort of his mother. But now we actually get to see, how she actually dealt with the issues that she had to go through. So I think, over the course of the books, that's definitely one of the strongest sort of elements here.
Yeah, and it's to the point where we're like going into this, we were just like, oh yeah, like they're probably going to have to tackle like, how did Ursa and Ozai get married? And it's like, was it an arranged marriage, or what? Was she a... Because, like, the reveal from 306 that, Zuko is actually related to Roku as well, through his mother's side of the family. You feel that primarily in terms of its connection to, like, Aang and Zuko. But you almost, like, forget that, like, oh, that means Ursa herself is, like, directly related to Roku, as that lineage to an avatar, and, like, how did that relate to her? How did, someone like that, like, friend turned enemy, royal family, suddenly come back into it? And the reveal here that, like, that bloodline was kind of sought out to increase the bloodline is, I think, a really interesting plot point. But, yeah, let's get into it. We're going to do it in our kind of usual way we do it when we take a look back on kind of episodes or comics, and just go through it, bring up a bunch of talking points. So we'll be kind of jumping around a bit. We won't be doing it in just direct chronological order, but we'll do our best to cover everything as much as possible. So, Greg, what's the first talking point about the search you want to bring up?
Yeah, so I guess sort of going in line of that, but I guess just sort of the family sort of like legacy that we see, just the plot line throughout the book, just sort of what sort of, I guess, sort of, Zuko and his sort of family here, but I guess also including sort of the spirits in the family there, and just sort of, I guess, just sort of that, I guess, sort of familiar sort of like connection that, the whole book wants to sort of, obviously show strong emphasis on, either with sort of like, brother and sister, with the sort of three pairs of siblings that we see throughout this book, or just sort of like the family aspect in general. I think that's, one of obviously the strongest sort of things about this is just sort of the book sort of showing that connection, showing, I guess sort of what lengths, family members are willing to do to sort of, protect their own.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the main themes of the book, and they definitely present it pretty well early on, in that they're getting a boring political lecture from this guy, and the one thing that like Zuko latches onto is that the word family comes up, and I love how it links back into the promise, because at the end of the promise, like I think Zuko talked about, how like his weakness is always going to be his like decision making, but he thinks it also links into the fact that he's kind of incomplete as a person because the mystery of his mother is still hanging over his head. So the disconnect from his father, the disconnect from his sister, that these are issues that he needs to deal with, his decision making plus his family problems. So here is Zuko trying to deal with that other side of him. He sort of dealt with the decision making in the promise. Now let's try and get Zuko sort of whole again by dealing with his family issues. And so I love the approach of the book of like him really trying basically with Azula, seeing how Sokka is with Katara, always doing these little moments, these things for her that she's maybe not even aware of, but just as a brother, how he looks out for her. The whole Misu and Rafa thing, that's the significance of why their arc is brought into this. She doing everything she can to get her brother's face back, and him trying to do the same for his own younger sister, and trying to do these little things, trying to reconnect with her, but it not quite working out the way you'd expect, because they have such a fractured relationship, and that the book isn't just Ursa as the focus, it's also, Zuko focus, it's also Azula focus, and so the book's strength is really just that it has all these kind of things going on, and I really do like how it's done, in addition to like just with Ursa herself and her own sort of family things of like the sacrifices she makes for, the part of her family she cares about, her children, and then she finally sort of makes a decision for herself to have a happy family, and how it kind of comes back, and how does she deal with now going forward in the aftermath of this, kind of having two families that have to come together. So I think that the theme of family is just, I think, really well done. They mention so much, but what else do you want to say about this?
Yeah, no, I think, seeing the lengths that they go through for certain thing, and just so, I don't know, even with sort of like, the mother phases in Ko, and sort of how that gets, sort of Rafa sort of face back, just sort of, that relationship, and knowing that sort of like Ko was sort of, sort of like cast out of, sort of being part of, I guess sort of her group in general, and, sort of him, Ko, and doing his own sort of like vendetta. I think it's interesting just to see, I guess sort of what lengths, different things have to go through in order to sort of, face these sort of relations. So I thought that was definitely, something that, the book obviously was going to sort of touch on here and sort of do well. And, I think it's good that it shows, both sides of it, because, Zuko and Azula, obviously, even by the end of the book, that sort of relationship isn't really sort of clear what's going on. And, even, later on into other books where we see, sort of their relationship be brought back up again, is still, it's not something that's sort of fully fleshed out. And it's probably one of the things that, fans of the show definitely sort of want, more information about. So I think that's definitely, as far as future stuff goes, that would be something that would be cool to see as well.
Mm-hmm. My first talking point, I suppose, is going to be, I suppose we have to go big in this one from the start, just because there's so many plot points. I'm going to go into Azula first, because obviously, like her plot points will continue as we go forward in the comics. We'll eventually get back to her, but this was the book that really sort of gets it started. Her kind of cliffhanger reveal of her at the end of the last book was got people excited, and here we get to see what she's like now, sort of post mental breakdown. And I think it's a really interesting approach of like having her be calm, her usual self some of the time, but then also be just as bad as she was in the finale at other times, that she is still affected by the same thing she was previously, and that mainly being her relationship, her fractured relationship with her mother, and constantly having those visions. And anytime she sees a reflection, she always, sees her mother saying things. And because it's all in her head, it's this idea of like, she knows her mother did love her, but I suppose it's almost like Azula's view of herself has been the whole, she thought I was a monster type thing, but she knows that her mother cared for her, and it's just this fight within Azula about like the way she was kind of naturally turning out, and just the way the whole family dynamic went. And you see that throughout the whole book of like her, constantly teasing Zuko, still thinking she should work for Ozai and try and get Zuko off the throne by using the letter to sort of remove his claim to the throne, and then how confused and emotional she is when she finally realizes that Noriko is Ursa. And finally, like that first confrontation that the two of them have, she runs away from it before she can really confront Ursa. That she, for most of this book, like Azula acts like Ursa has sort of secretly got everyone in Azula's life to go against her, that she blames what happened with Mei and Ty Lee on her mother for some reason, somehow. She blames Team Avatar interfering with her plans on her mother, and it's really thought-provoking, like, going back to this stuff, given where she is, like, at the end of Smoke and Shadow, to kind of get a sense for what way they're going in. But I think the main thing that I always kind of think about whenever this discussion comes up is like, are they actually going for a redemption arc for Azula? And the thing that really confirms to me that this is the direction they're heading in is that, like, all the way back in like part 1 of the search, you have that moment before they set out, and Iroh is talking to them, and Iroh says, "Ever since my nephew ascended to the throne, he has yearned for peace. Finding Ursa may bring that peace, and not just for himself," as Iroh and Aang both glance over to Azula. And I think just the fact that it's Iroh mentioning the idea of like sort of Azula finding that peace, Azula finding that sort of change that Zuko went through. That is the comic saying that you're meant to view Azula as if she's capable of change as well. And I just really like that they seem to be going down that path of creating an arc for her. But what are your thoughts on Azula throughout this book, her first real proper appearance in the comics?
Yeah, no, I think from what we've seen so far, and just I guess the general tone of the book, or just the general tone of the world, the idea that Azula as being one of the characters that could seek redemption, I think is something that definitely is possible, and it seems like it's something that I think would be good for them to sort of go through here. I mean, it's interesting to follow her path through these 3 books just to see sort of how she sort of reflects on herself, just sort of as a character, and what sort of, I guess, triggers, she has to sort of, bring, sort of her mother's sort of self-imposed sort of hatred perspective on herself, into play, and just to see her sort of, lash out at, various different characters throughout the whole series, and how that sort of, typically happens at sort of like inopportune sort of moments here. And she's sort of she has her own sort of goals at this one, and it's definitely not sort of resolved by the end of things, and she sort of has a lot to sort of work on here. But the fact that we see Zuko sort of trying with Azula here, and when we do sort of get the sort of moments of Azula sort of having sort of like basically just like lucid moments where she's actually able to sort of interact, overall I think it's just it's an interesting perspective to see here, and I think it's it definitely leads you towards the path that there's definitely a lot more that can be, done with her character, which is something that we're definitely sort of hoping that they'll do with, sooner rather than later.
hmm And at the start of the Search Part 2, I think there's a really interesting quote from, like, it's Azula asleep, obviously, like, imagining what her mother would say to her. And she says,
Mm-hmm.
I should probably be grateful. After all, you saved me the trouble of finding you. And Ursa says, all your life you've hidden behind a mask of intimidation and fear. Azula just says, prepare to meet your doom. Take off your mask, only then will you see the beauty of your true destiny. And Azula just says, no, no. Why must you fill my mind with such lies? The throne is my destiny, isn't it? I mean, I have proof. And I think that's just like that's the character arc of Azula. It's what will finally break her out of the always wanting to control people through intimidation and fear. Um, and we've seen over the course of the comics since this point her move to the point of like, okay, she realizes the throne isn't her destiny, but she's still focused on it to a degree, in that she still feels that the throne needs someone like her, but it's just her trying to form Zuko now into basically her ideal self. It's not realizing that they're basically she's being told like, you know, your destiny is not related to the throne. The To find your true self, you need to basically find out who you are without controlling people through fear. That's why she lost May and Ty Lee, and everyone sort of turned against her. We're waiting for that to happen, and she's developed a bit, but not fully. And I just really like that there's a lot of groundwork set in the search, that we can always go back to. Um, and then the last bit, just I'll say here, is just the one line that Noriko, like, this is before Ursa gets her memories back, but like at this point she basically has been told by everyone else that you are the mother of Zuko and Azula. And Azula is confronting her, and she says, if what you say is true, if I really am your mother, then I'm sorry I didn't love you enough. And Azula kind of tears up. And it's interesting that like Zuko is the one to get in between them at this point, and it eventually leads to Azula running off before she gets her opportunity to like confront Ursa. And then since this book, they've not really come anywhere near interacting. So that's why we're waiting for the big, actual confrontation between the two of them. But what are some more of your thoughts on Azula and what they do with her?
Yeah, no, I think that confrontation is something that we're really sort of interested in seeing here, because like you mentioned, with the little bit that we see here when she didn't have her memories, you can tell that there's a lot that Ursa needs to sort of deal with, Azula specifically, and just sort of how everything sort of goes down with that. I mean, I think through the flashbacks that we see in here, we can definitely see that it's not like, Ursa sort of like had any sort of like general sort of hatred towards sort of like Azula sort of as being her child, but we can definitely see, I guess, sort of, early developmental things of, Azula that, definitely seems like her initial sort of, I guess, just the way that she was developing as a child was skewed one way or other, either through, obviously the influence of Ozai, or just sort of the nation in general, how it was sort of back then. So there's definitely a lot that can be done there as far as their sort of dynamic, as well as just sort of like, Ursa's whole sort of new family that she has here, and how that's sort of going to be sort of, related to everything, which is definitely going to be a big sort of point.
Yeah, and then the moment where she sort of crashes in on the family when she realizes who
Hmm.
Noriko is, tell me, mother, did you have to have a new daughter because your last one turned out to be such a monster? That's a pretty kind of cutting line, and it makes me think about like that whole line about my mother thought I was a monster. Like, did we ever get confirmation that like Ursa actually said something like that to her? Like, we've seen moments where like Ursa in the past has like punished Azula, but did Ursa ever directly basically say the line monster in relation to Azula, or is that just Azula assuming Ursa thinks that way?
Yeah, I mean, that's always an interesting point, because it doesn't seem like there's any direct line for that. I mean, I don't know, because you see, a bit of, young Azula being sort of a bit sort of manipulative of sort of the situation here, but we never see, Ursa sort of coming back at it. So up until this point, it doesn't seem, that we see anything like that. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if it comes out later on that, Ursa had like some sort of fear of her own sort of daughter and what she could become or what she's sort of turning out into, but it doesn't seem like straight up sort of like animosity that she has to her.
Yeah, and I suppose that will lead into my next talking point, which is, I suppose, in the flashbacks, the Ursa and Azula interactions that we actually see, in that we see a couple of scenes of Ursa sort of scolding Azula, but I think scolding her for like clear bad behavior, in that like some of the things like Azula says and jokes about, like obviously they link into bits we saw on the show of like Azula laughing and making fun of the idea that like Azulon wants Ozai to kill Zuko, and she's like laughing about that. And I think like the closest to the whole monster line we got was like Ursa saying like something along the lines of like, what is wrong with that girl, or something like that. Like, how did she turn out like this, or something. Like obviously like Ursa knows there's kind of something different, like it's not just Ozai's influence that is kind of making kind of Azula turn out this way. Like I think that's the point that we have here, is that like this is just sort of inherent to the way Azula is as a character, at least to a degree, and it means her behavior isn't great. But I'm like, is Ursa necessarily wrong for like scolding her like that? But at the same time, you do have her in any scene where she has to talk to Ozai. She always talks about how, like, she wants to take the kids, both of the kids. Both of them are, the things she cares about from that old life. They're both the things that kind of keep her attached to the past, and why she hesitates before forgetting her past life. And then I thought one of the best parts in the book was, like, we always knew about from the show, the moment as Ursa is banished, Zuko wakes up and we get the "never forget who you are" line. But that just prior to that, she did actually go to visit Azula, except Azula didn't wake up, but she still had a similar moment with her, that she wasn't forgotten in any of this. So it's an interesting one, in that they're going to have to address the idea of like that. In some ways, I suppose Ursa didn't know how to deal necessarily with some of Azula's behavior, and that some of it is because she was so close to Ozai and stuff like that, and that's going to be interesting. But at the same time, I think a lot of people who maybe defend Azula a lot tend to almost like use these scenes to be like, Ursa was a bad parent or mother because she, scolded Azula for doing this. But like, some of the stuff that she says is a bit much. So what are your thoughts on the Azula-Ursa interactions that we see here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. As far as it making her seem out to be a bad mother, I think that more onus could be put on just sort of like her sort of like wanting to forget about, her and Azula, I mean, and Zuko in general. So I could see the post sort of being put on her for not being sort of like the best sort of mother in general. But as far as, the younger bit of sort of interactions that we see here with her, usually is her sort of scolding sort of Azula for sort of like, burning the bush, or for like, messing with Zuko or something along those lines. I don't think those in themselves are enough sort of evidence to sort of see her out as being a bad mother, unless you're sort of going to go along the lines of her just like, how did Azula get to that way in the first place? Like, she didn't do enough, before, whatever stuff that she could have done as a mother to sort of gear Azula towards not being the way that she is. But, some of that seems to be sort of like, I guess sort of Azula's sort of drive as sort of a character in general, just sort of the whole idea of her having like the spark from birth versus what Zuko, I guess, apparently didn't have as much, which almost led to his demise straight up from the beginning, until he was, I guess, sort of shown to be a firebender. So just sort of that whole dynamic that they have as sort of a family, and that is, I guess, sort of interesting in itself. So I don't know, I think there's some early developmental things there with Azula that I guess just sort of couldn't have been skewed one way or the other. And over time, maybe that could have been changed. That's something that, we never really got to see or could be imagined because, of course, Ursa had to leave after everything that she did there to sort of, keep them sort of, or to keep Zuko alive to sort of begin with. So I don't know. I think there's not quite enough evidence there to see, her sort of being a bad mother as far as that sort of initial stuff sort of goes. Later on, yeah, I definitely can sort of see that, and that's something that'll be interesting to see if Ursa and Azula ever get to sort of have a real sort of discussion about that, how that sort of plays out. I think that'll probably be more telling than anything else that we've seen so far.
Mm. Yeah, because a lot of it does just come back on like the family dynamic, and that um, Azula was kind of like in a way like protected, like insulated from Ozai because she was so talented, and he immediately sort of latched onto her as the hope for like the next generation, basically, as opposed to Zuko. Um, and so because of that, and because Ozai clearly had issues with Zuko, Ursa felt the need to protect Zuko, um, which comes across as if like she didn't have those interactions with like Azula ever. And it probably comes down to stuff like we don't really know necessarily what like say Ozai and Azula's like dynamic was. Like we don't really have too many scenes of those two talking together. The one or two times we really see it in like the show, it's like right at the end, and it's kind of a slightly different dynamic because of Azula's kind of mental situation. And I'd like to see that. And like, does he just treat her like a tool, basically? Like, which I think that's most of the speculation that the fandom has at this point, is that, he cares about her to a certain degree, but mainly because of how skilled she is. That she can be the perfect weapon for him. That's all he really sees her as. That the kids are just, their skills, basically. That's all he really cares about. And she was turning out more like him, so he focused on her, and the dynamic of the family kind of shifted. Basically, the second bending was kind of brought into play, and you can see he kind of favors her, and that like Azula's just allowed to sort of talk to him pretty casually at like the dinner table and talk about like my firebending tutor Cunyo, which is a nice The Promise reference, like told me to do this, and he's just like, oh, we'll get him kind of sent to the colonies, and that's the setup for The Promise, and he's just willing to just agree with her basically on those things, whereas like Zuko is banished for talking out of turn, and she's just allowed to like criticize her teachers completely at will, and it's almost that idea of like, does Ozai like ever scold Azula? We see him slightly do it in like the finale, but it's because she's clearly like deteriorating kind of quite rapidly, and it's almost to a point where like you almost get the impression he never really raises his voice with her or something like that. But what's your take on the Ozai Azula dynamic, and like where the loyalty lies there and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, that's definitely one that needs to, I guess, sort of be sort of cleared out. And I know it sort of makes me wonder, sort of like when they had that sort of closed talk, when they were older, sort of what even happened there to sort of, start the whole thing with Azula and the letter and how that sort of worked out. Like, was that just another, way of him sort of using, her as a tool to sort of, cast out on Zuko? But yeah, I think, that dynamic there definitely seems like it's more sort of, skill based, ability based versus sort of any sort of familiar sort of relation. But I think that's sort of one of the, just the issues in general with the Fire Nation royal family, I guess maybe up until Zuko's, lineage now, is just, is sort of seen just more as sort of like a royal sort of dictatorship, and sort of how, they can stay in control of the Fire Nation. So the whole idea, just Ozai and Ursa's sort of relationship in general, just, obviously didn't even start from the best sort of a places there. So, I think that dynamic just has, it's too harsh to sort of look on it as sort of like any sort of, I guess sort of, nice sort of family dynamic that you would, typically sort of think of in any sort of like situation, or, just what we've seen in other places throughout, the Avatar sort of universe. So that, I think in itself is just sort of like, it's not starting from a good place. So it's never really going to sort of end up in sort of a better place from what we've seen so far, at least. So the whole idea of, Zula being, used more as a tool because of her ability, and that sort of giving her more leeway versus, Zuko and him just sort of not really being up to the same standard as Azula was, even from like a younger, just sort of, obviously skews things towards her sort of favor and just sort of her, getting what she sort of wants, like you mentioned of, the firebending teacher being sent away. So clearly there's sort of a favoritism there.
Yeah, and it it just makes me kind of think like by the time Smoke and Shadow starts, I think Azula says something along the lines of that like she's sort of done with Ozai. She doesn't care about him anymore. I can't remember the exact dialogue, but I think she basically refers to the idea that like he doesn't even have bending anymore, and the sort of
Mm.
loyalty that is shown here in the search is gone at that point, which gives the impression to me that there was never any like warmness there in that she just respected his power and like what he thought her, and now that he has nothing to offer her, she's sort of done with him. So, um, I'm I kind of question if maybe there's much Ozai stuff will come into play in terms of the resolution to this outside of just he didn't care in the end. Like Ursa says to Ozai in Smoke and Shadow, it's like you didn't have room in your heart for anyone, and that I think includes Azula. He just uh, you had some level of respect for her because of her skills, and everyone knows how skilled Azula is, as she demonstrates pretty nicely over the course of this book, within kind of a sort of an advanced form of lightning bending and stuff like that. It's pretty interesting, but it does all come down to the fact that Ursa and Azula need to have that talk at some point and really break down what is at the heart of it, and that in many ways to us it's like this idea of who is Azula behind the that mask of intimidation and fear, and like masks is sort of another
Hmm.
theme of this book, and the idea of like forgetting, hiding behind things. What does that Azula look like? I think the only real times we've seen a glimpse of like who that different Azula is in the beach, and how sort of in a way vulnerable in a way she is when she doesn't know what to do with regards to like flirting and has to go to like Ty Lee for advice. That's one of the few times I think we see like real Azula, or like that different side to her that we don't often get to see. But what are your thoughts on that? About like where do they need to take Azula given the setup?
Yeah, no, I think being able to see the true face of Azula is something that will be really sort of, I guess, just revealing in sort of how, she interacts with the character, like the whole idea of her being on the beach and sort of being, not in control of the situation is something that we're gonna have to see her. It definitely seems like it's coming that, more and more she's being placed in situations where, she doesn't have anyone else to sort of push around, or she doesn't quite know, sort of the right route to sort of take things. I think is something that's going to be, interesting for her sort of development. I think, if she ever does come back into the group with everybody, just her family in general and the Royal Nation, I think will be, I don't know, a key sort of element to seeing how she's going to go and deal with things. Just her, I guess, her being able to come to some sort of level of sort of mental stability, I think is definitely going to be important for her as a character, just to see how she works throughout the whole thing. Because I don't know, it's interesting to see throughout this book sort of how she sort of like flips back and forth and uses that to sort of, I don't know, it's her way of sort of like forcing her hand on the situation through various points throughout this whole book.
Yeah, and it just makes me think that I think a large part of what we need to see from Azula is just to her just to admit like honestly how she feels about a lot of this stuff. Like she's clearly very hurt by the betrayal of May and Ty Lee, who she sort of gets across the idea of just like, oh, that they were just people on my team. I never really cared about them, but the truth is she really did, and is baffled by how they went against her. And it's this idea of like she doesn't know, like in a way, what almost like started that friendship in the first place, what kept them around her, and what kind of changed. And I think it's going to take stuff like just her kind of admitting to herself that she is hurt by the fact that she's not friends with them anymore. She doesn't have this good relationship with her mother, and that like the moment in like the beach where like she so quickly snaps back of like, my mother thought I was a monster. She's right. Like just that switch of like, she was about to go that little bit further, but then immediately reverted back to normal Azula and just said, brushed it away. I don't care that my mother thought about me that way. That unwillingness to just kind of have that emotional moment that say Azuka would have had, just kind of push some of those scenes going forward. But what is your next talking point about the search?
I guess sort of including Azula, but just sort of our traveling group in general, just sort of how they're sort of all interacting with Azula, and just sort of as a group, I think it's interesting just to see, them going on this, another sort of like adventure together, and just sort of how, there's sort of, obviously almost all of them except for Zuko has, a general sort of mistrust from, Azula from, being chased for the past three, series, with Azula, and then them, suddenly having to come into like direct contact with someone who was chasing them for so long, and sort of, obviously they can tell, Azula doesn't have the greatest sort of stability at this sort of moment, and sort of, throws a wrench into everything, and sort of they, have to sort of like take watches with her, and sort of, just sort of, Sokka, and just sort of the whole idea of him, thinking that he can sort of, do something with her and not really that working out. So, I don't know, I think just that whole dynamic of, this group, minus Toph, which they tried to get, but they couldn't get for, various reasons. Just sort of how that went out through the course of the whole sort of book.
Yeah, like, I think this is a really fun dynamic in that the moments where, like, Azula is kind of there, she's kind of lucid, and she's kind of, having the sort of banter back and forth with everyone, just being her sort of like, okay, I'm here, I'm kind of part of this group, let me see what you guys are like, not in a like combat situation, and she's just like making fun of this and that as part of the group, and that's kind of really fun to see. And it's like, okay, that's a part of Azula's character, that is sort of a part of the real Azula that she'll always have, that she's never going to be this like inherently 100% nice character, she's always going to be sort of cutting like this, but it is fun to see the way everyone sort of views her, and that like Aang, for most of the book, is kind of willing to be like, oh, I want to see if Azula can grow, like, because he has the scene with Iroh earlier on where he kind of acknowledges that, like, oh, this is a journey for Zuko, but it's also a journey for Azula, and he's kind of willing to sort of facilitate that, and so he doesn't have that much ill will towards her. He's like cautious around her, but is giving her that chance. Katara, of course, is probably the one who's like the most like on edge around her, because in many ways like Katara's the one who was almost like hurt the most by Azula, because she had to witness like Aang die, and then she had to revive Aang because of Azula. Aang probably doesn't remember most of the details of that who shot him down and stuff like that. Katara is the one who fought Azula, and so she's the one who's most ready to go and have a fight with Azula. And then Sokka is just, that humorous self of just like, okay, I'll take her. And I like that when they actually properly do have to like fight her, he does actually hold his own, in that like in the final sequence of the book, like he's fighting Azula on top of the house for like multiple minutes and like staying in the fight. So Sokka's pretty impressive with managing to sort of handle Azula in sort of one-on-one combat for at least a while. So that's a pretty cool thing with Sokka. But yeah, just it's a really fun dynamic. Like it's kind of why I hope as we get more of Azula stuff and she gets more of a focus, like in this book, I want to see the other characters show as much of an interaction with Azula as just the typical ones like your Zuko, Ursa, and so on. But what are your thoughts on her dynamic within the group?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely, like you mentioned, it can be sort of fun at times. It's definitely she's definitely more sort of aggressive, more sort of, pointing out the facts of things. Sort of like a even sort of meaner version of sort of like Toph. Toph will sort of like make fun of different situations, but she won't really sort of like cut sort of like a bit deeper as, Azula does, just because of either her character or because she's more, just sort of more manipulative in general. But, when we do see her interact with them, it's definitely an interesting sort of like back and forth with, ones that she views that, possibly could be sort of capable or can't be sort of capable, and sort of, where she does sort of want to help out the group when she sort of like gets all the bugs away with using like the lightning, sort of ball to sort of distract them all away. So, you can see her skills and how they sort of would, definitely benefit the group, because she, she really is sort of a prodigy of firebending, and, has so many of these sort of skills and sort of can develop things on sort of the fly, and it's sort of like, a very sort of like capable sort of like tactician in the moment without sort of like all the sort of like funny bits that Sokka would have. So she definitely adds something a lot to the group that, definitely can sort of benefit them. So it's nice, I guess, here to see sort of like a glimpse of how that could be if she was, more on the sort of like, sane sort of level, and didn't have as much sort of animosity towards the whole sort of group here. But, the idea that you mentioned of just sort of Katara is just sort of having, this sort of, just general sort of fear of what Azula can do from everything that she, has seen from her, I think is definitely sort of a good point here, as much as, Katara has sort of like hope for, just general things of, sort of turning out for the positive. Once, Katara has sort of like flipped the switch of seeing someone as being like an instant threat, she almost has like no remorse for here, and is like instantly willing to sort of like, freeze Azula up just to sort of, keep her in check or anything like here. So it's interesting to see, Katara on sort of the other side of that sort of, aspect of her personality.
Yeah, and I do like kind of Katara being treated as that character who's like the perfect counter to Azula, in a way that in nearly every engagement that they've had, like Katara's kind of had the edge over Azula. And I know a lot of people in terms of like power level discussion type stuff don't like to really talk about that, but here the way the scenes have sort of played out. My next talking point is one I just had to mention at some point in here, and it's just the cliffhanger of part one, the letter, the reveal at the end of part one that, oh, shock, horror, Zuko is not actually related to Ozai. And not just it and how it's used across as like a plot device in this book, but also just how this has like affected the fandom, because to this day there are still people who think that Zuko is not related to Ozai. And I don't get how that is the case. The two most popular videos on my YouTube channel that have like so many more views than everything else are the two videos I did on family trees. And in both of those videos I covered the Fire Nation family tree, and it includes Zuko as being related to Ozai. And the amount of comments on both of them that are just like, no, you're wrong. It was revealed in the search that Ikem is actually Zuko's father. And I have to explain it to them every time. No, this is the case. And even in that second video, which was basically remaking the video to make that point exceptionally clear, like I included the page where like it's revealed at the end that it was the letter was a lie and stuff like that. They're still arguing with me about it. Just like, no, I read it. And then I'm at the point now, whenever I get those comments, where I just immediately respond with, okay, where did you hear that? And half of the time people is like, oh yeah, I read it in the search. And then I'm like, did you finish reading the search? And again, it's like, people will say, no, I only read the first part. And then there will still be people who are like, I read all 3 parts, and I still took that away from it. So it's just this baffling situation where somewhere online there's like a big news post out there that like is reveals that like Zuko is not actually related to Ozai, and like people find out about that before they find out about the truth. It's really crazy the amount of time that this still comes up, because I still really like this as a plot point, because it allowed Zuko to then like have to just explore within himself what it means that like he's not actually potentially royalty, and like dealing with the idea of like, I'm the Fire Lord, but I'm not actually related to this kind of royal family, and how he's sort of accepting it by the end, and it was an interesting exploration of that, and we sort of knew, but got a sense, especially by like part 2 and 3, that like they're going to turn it back around. But I liked what it allowed them to sort of explore, of just this letter and how it could change everything. This kind of last ditch attempt by Ozai, but he knew from the get go that it was a lie. That they specifically have a scene of like, come on, Ozai, you knew it was a lie. There's no way it could have been that case. So what are your thoughts, and I suppose your experience with this kind of cliffhanger, this misinformation in the fandom?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I guess that's interesting to note, just sort of people's sort of perspective on it and sort of what they sort of take from that. I don't know, I mean, I guess that's sort of, I don't know, I mean, that to me sort of, it almost goes in line with the whole idea of like Azula, of Zuko and sort of Katara sort of being together sort of as a couple, sort of that sort of fan idea of sort of pairing or imposing on sort of the situation. But I think, overall, I mean, I think it was an interesting just sort of, thought experiment as far as, how would that go down? How would, Zuko sort of handle this sort of thing? Would he just sort of stay there as sort of like the symbol of peace, which is sort of what Aang was sort of mentioning, regardless of what the situation sort of turned out? So, I mean, I think it's definitely an interesting sort of plot device, and I think, the fact that it gets, Zuko thinking about things in sort of a different light is definitely, it's a good way of sort of forcing Zuko's character to sort of deal with the situation at hand, which is sometimes, it's one of the things that he's always sort of struggled with. But, here he sort of has to come to it. And, I think I think it would have turned out probably, overall pretty well, regardless of what it sort of came down to. But I don't know, I think the whole idea of that letter and just sort of how, Azula tries to use it, throughout the whole situation with like, sort of like fake sort of burning it. I almost sort of forgot how she sort of got the letter in the first place. So that was cool to sort of reread again here. But no, I mean, I don't know, I think it's an interesting way, but I don't think it holds, as much sort of, water or importance as, we later might think it to really sort of be.
And your next talking point?
I guess I'll go just in general more just sort of the idea of how, the spirits were used in these 3 books. I guess sort of getting to see, I don't know, the group sort of interact with these spirits that they all can sort of see sort of like in real time, and sort of the legend and lore sort of, I guess, sort of behind them, just sort of the idea of the Mother of Faces. I remember that being something that was really sort of interesting to me overall from when I first read it to even rereading it here, and just sort of director with Ko and sort of how Aang was sort of like affected by the spirits in general, since that's not something that I could recall seeing in the show or mentioned as much, just sort of like the real sort of like, physical manifestations that he had, like, when his faces were changing to the shapes of, the spirits, or the faces on the spirits around them, and sort of how that sort of worked. And, even here we do get to see Aang go into the spirit realm a little bit here and sort of interact with the spirits directly. But I don't know, I think just overall how the lore of that sort of was woven into the story and the villages, and how, people sort of knew about it, and they were able to sort of, I don't know, it seemed like they were able to do a lot more with the spirits in this one from, I guess a general people's perspectives, rather than just sort of like Aang being sort of like the bridge and everything. I think this one did interesting way of really sort of integrating, at least up until this point, since we do have later on comics that do have more of the stories. But I think this is definitely one of the stronger points that I really sort of liked about this series in general.
Yeah, I think just in general, this point is one that, like, I think this is one of Gene Yang's biggest strengths as a writer, is just how he wrote spirits, of like just utilizing that fact that of course there are spirits who have an impact on the physical world. We were already told that in Avatar, but it wasn't explored as much, only like a handful of spirits, and that like there were teases of things like the actual painted lady, and like the moon spirit. And here he just kind of touches on that little bit more, of just like, okay, if there's a spirit that takes people's faces, what if we introduce the idea that like a spirit kind of like introduced almost like individuality to the world, and that's what the Mother of Faces directly says here, that people would not have individual faces if not for her impact on the world. And I love that reveal that the spirits have children, that Ko is the Mother of Faces' son, and that a very sort of human type dynamic of just a fractured family is something she struggles with, and then has to deal with sort of her hypocrisy of her being sort of critical of humans for having their issues and wanting to forget about things when she's dealing with the very same thing. And just I love that idea of that they create like a ritual here, that she's willing to sort of offer like one wish basically every season effectively. She's willing to interact with like one human every season to just kind of fulfill her role. That's all she can kind of handle of humans, and there's a whole ritual of you having to find the pool that the spirit wolf is beside, and then that's when you'll actually interact with the Mother of Faces if it's the right time. That all kind of to me makes lots of sense of just like, yeah, in this kind of era where humans and spirits don't get along so much, of course anything that would require humans and spirits to interact would be a very sort of complicated process at this point. And I just think it all comes together pretty nicely here, of just like Aang making that argument of like, you know, I want you to help out these two people, and he's the one really presenting that idea of like, they're not perfect, you're not perfect, help them. And that's one of the biggest praises I can give to Gene Yang, that I think in many ways he's kind of been one of, if not our absolute best writer of spirits, full stop, because the next comic has probably like the best spirit story with the whole Lady Tianhai, General Old Iron stuff. And even the Kimura Kage from Smoke and Shadow is a very, very good story. I think just some of the world building stuff with spirits that he's managed to do over the course of these books has been very, very impressive. But what are your thoughts on the use of spirits here?
Yeah, no, I think the way that it's woven into the story here with, sort of the family dynamic that the spirits have and how they're interacting with the world, I think is definitely one of the strengths that we have here, and just sort of how Aang is, he's trying to be the bridge, but he still has, even as sort of like the Avatar Aang here, he's citing more on the side in this case with sort of like the human aspect of things and the human sort of way of, being a bit more sort of forthright and forceful with, dealing with the situation, rather than taking sort of like, I guess, his sort of like typical sort of high road of sort of waiting and meditating things out here. So I think that's an interesting way just to see, that level of interaction here, and how, overall as a larger sort of scheme thing, how it plays into, I guess, sort of at least, villages in this, sort of world that sort of knows about the Mother and Faces, how, she was known in sort of the Fire Nation scroll that one of the characters sort of found here, and sort of how that led them to be here, and how, even if the full legend is still, a bit of a complicated process to actually sort of meet her and to sort of let things sort of happen here. So I think it's definitely interesting to see, how that sort of plays out here, how, everyone has a different, sort of dynamic with interacting with the spirit in general. I think it's definitely really cool to see.
Mm-hmm. My next talking point is going to be Ozai. So in The Promise, we talked about how it was the book that really sort of took Ozai from being like a threatening villain in terms of like the setup and some of the family ties that he has, but like personality wise you don't really get that much on him, to The Promise was what really showcased that, like here's that manipulative side. This is where like Azula gets some of that from, and because he's talking all that more, you get more of his personality. And I think you get more of that here through the flashbacks that we have here, of this is how he was during that whole process, the marriage with Ursa, and how just cruel he is. That is just, at a base level, who he is. Just those moments, like at the sort of wedding reception, basically, things are going okay. Ursa's like, okay, cool, like my family's allowed to be here, so at least that'll be okay. And then he just says to her, you better have a last conversation with them because it's the last time you're going to see them. Like I won't let you see them again. You belong to me. Like he literally says that to her in her ear in like a threatening way. That is like he pretty much just like accepts that he's going to make her life, a living hell from here on out. Just that's the approach that he takes, and that's who he is, and how he monitors her communications like back to her hometown and stuff like that. And like she obviously is terrified of him, as we learn, and he knows that, and just the way he is with her, it's really really gets across just how, you know he's more like terrifying here in these scenes where you get to see that more personal side of him than he is as the like physical threat that we see in ATLA, at least in my opinion. And this really helps to get across that idea of, it's what makes that moment in Smoke and Shadows so sort of satisfying, is when she finally speaks up to him and just calls him out for being sort of as pathetic as he is, and needing to go to this lens of like punishing his kids, punishing his wife for all of these things that happen, and just how, spiteful, kind of vindictive he is. Like, oh, he figures out that, like, Ikem must still be alive, so he sends Vashir back to, take him out, and then gloats about it to her, even though he knows that he's still out there. Just the things that he will do to sort of bring Ursa down. So what were your thoughts on Ozai's portrayal in this book?
Yeah, no, I think for sure the personal touch with Ozai, I think definitely works more to get across sort of how, how vile sort of like as a character he is in general. Because when he's sort of seen as sort of like, the lord of the Fire Nation, empire or kingdom, the Phoenix King, and everything that he sort of, turns out to be or tries to be, he's just sort of seen as sort of like this big bad sort of villain that, as from like, a story point perspective, that, that's sort of the whole goal of, at least this sort of typical series, to sort of, be the one that you eventually sort of defeat here. But to see him here in this more sort of, domestic role, when he's not, in charge of the nation, he's just sort of like the second in line prince, that, this is what, sort of really makes him such sort of like a vile sort of character, just sort of, his, sort of forceful of this sort of marriage, having these two kids, obviously sort of like favoring one over the others, and, what length he was willing to go through to sort of, keep his place on the throne here, that, Ursa has to sort of, become involved with just to sort of save her own son here. So this is where you get to see sort of, the other side of his character, to hear him actually have, some conversations more than like a couple, lines here or there, and basically just sort of plot points to sort of, say that we're sort of going to go to sort of take over the world here. So I think, seeing these flashbacks, which, we're sort of talking about the focus that they have on Ursa as a character, they have, just as large importance on Ozai and fleshing out his character that, we really didn't get throughout the series, because, there's a lot to do throughout the whole series, and the series is definitely, more sort of linear as far as the storytelling goes, as far as, point A to B here. So here we finally get to see some of the earlier sort of A points that sort of led our characters sort of to be together in the first place, and how, their sort of dynamic worked out. So no, I think it's definitely a really interesting, tale to see, how everything sort of went down here. I wish there was, I guess a bit more sort of interactions with Ozai and sort of like the kids in general from the younger age. I think that's something that we've mentioned earlier that would have been interesting to see how that sort of, dynamic all sort of played out, or even with Ozai and sort of like Iroh and, their father, I think would be definitely interesting to see. I mean, I don't know, it's something that we haven't really seen, them in sort of that sort of like, trifecta of a group. I think that would be really interesting to see just sort of how that dynamic all worked out, or if it even worked out. It might not have.
Yeah, and that's where like the whole, what's the dynamic like between the brothers? Well, what's Iroh and Ozai's dynamic is something that everyone talks about and how we know so little about it, outside of the fact that Ozai obviously doesn't respect the unique kind of personality that Iroh has. But yeah, just some of the stuff that Ozai kind of does in this, and just like his, and I suppose his father's entire approach to this marriage is just they only care about Ursa for her bloodline, for the potential of Ozai's children to have powerful firebenders. That basically their plan was Azula. Effectively, they wanted an extraordinarily powerful firebender out of this, who would have this like perfect kind of bloodline going on. That's all that they wanted. Like, it's clear that Ozai doesn't care or love Ursa at all. He just makes no acknowledgement of that at all. Doesn't try really. All he cares about is just that he has a future, for the throne, and then that's all he wanted. He doesn't care about how it looks that like his wife randomly goes missing or something like that. Just that he was given this opportunity to get the throne, and all he had to do was just spare his son's life, and he got the throne, and that's all. Because he was willing to do that. Like, that's another thing. Like, he was actually willing to go ahead with what his father said, and feel the same pain that Iroh felt, and kill Zuko until Ursa suggested that. And then even like right towards the end of part 3, the scene where they actually reveal that the letter isn't true. And, he says, "Why would you write such an obvious lie?" And she says, "Maybe I wanted to see if you were reading my private letters. Maybe I wanted to hurt you even for a moment. Maybe it was just my wishful thinking." And he says, "Is that truly what you wish, that Zuko were not mine?" And she says, "That he turns out nothing like you, yes." And then he just says, "Then that's how I'll treat him, dear wife. I want you to watch carefully from now on. Every time I speak harshly to him, every time I wound him, every time I treat Zuko as if he were the son of a treacherous dog, I will simply be fulfilling his mother's wish." That he is so spiteful that he'll turn this argument with Ursa into the reason why he treats Zuko so badly. Like, that is the root of like why Zuko had such a terrible sort of upbringing. And in a way, like, here's a good explanation for why Ursa sort of focuses so much on Zuko, because Ozai directly told her, "I'm going to treat him terribly from here on out, and it's your fault." And so she, of course, feels responsible for that and needs to kind of protect and shield him from that stuff. So, like, I think that was really well written in a way of like that it wasn't just this kind of, the letter is like this kind of crazy thing for a cliffhanger at the end of part 1. They bring it back around and have like her attempt to sort of hurt Ozai in some way ends up being this thing that hurts Zuko so badly. But what are your thoughts on that? That is such a like big moment towards the end of the book. What are your thoughts on that reveal of like that's why Ozai treats Zuko so badly?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely interesting, and just sort of how that, probably works out, in the end for Zuko's benefit, because he was so sort of like, just sort of not in the good graces of his father, that sort of pushed him towards the path that was, sort of a lot, better in one case, and just, of course it caused him a lot of, strife and turmoil, just sort of internally, because he could never sort of get that approval there. But no, I think that's definitely a very sort of interesting, thing or point to make. And, from that regard, you could also say that's like another one of those things that, checks off a moment of, Ursa maybe not being the best sort of mother, even though, she probably had like the better sort of like intentions overall as far as, not wanting Zuko to turn out like Ozai, just because of Ozai's character in general. So no, I think that's definitely very sort of, telling just on, Ozai's sort of character, just sort of like you mentioned, this sort of, spite and resentment that he'll sort of like hold on to for any sort of like length of time, or, as long as Zuko was sort of involved with his father, so, up until he's 16 or however old he was at that point there. So, I don't know, I mean, it's definitely a very sort of telling thing just about, sort of Ozai and his family dynamic. I mean, it makes me sort of wonder, if he would have went through with everything that Zoan had planned and just sort of, took Zuko out of the picture there, would he have felt that same sort of, remorse that, Iroh felt when he lost his sort of son there, or would he been, just fine with Azula being there and being the one who would sort of like take everything over? I mean, I don't even know, as far as his character, how much he can sort of, feel or would feel those sort of emotions. So it would have been, I don't know, it's an interesting sort of thought process just to see, what could have happened in this sort of situation here. But, the fact that he is able to sort of come past this and sort of, come out on top of everything definitely shows a lot about his character in sort of the worst ways.
Yeah, it's just this like this kind of basically jealousy from him, that he was so jealous of the fact that like Ursa's heart was always back in Hira with Ikam, and that she would never actually care about him the way she cared about Ikam, and that's why he does all of this stuff. It definitely helps to get across that like he is a true villain, but like the him doing these more sort of personal things, I think means so much more than just him being that kind of threat that we see in ATLA. But what's your next talking point?
I guess I want to talk, a little bit about some of the smaller moments that we have here, sort of with, sort of the moments that we have with sort of, the Kyoshi Warriors with Suki and Ty Lee. I think, there's a lot of big overall things, but there's also, a couple sort of smaller moments throughout the book that we see here that, I think is interesting to note and to see, if they turn out to anything more in, either future books that are coming up or just future stories in general.
Yeah, like especially towards the start of the book, before like the group heads out, we do get like to see a lot of characters as we go through this, and I think there's some setups of like obviously a lot of the big picture stuff is set up. We can come back to it at some point, but there's also stuff like Mei and Zuko broke up in the last book, and they're still broken up in this book, and they're still broken up now, and it's like when are some of these plot threads going to sort of come back together, and so on. There's a lot of nice little moments of like this is the debut of like we get to see more National Tea Appreciation Day with Iroh in charge. That so this is what life would have been like with Iroh as the Fire Lord, just him making this stuff up along the way. Um, and there's lots of kind of fun little moments like that. Even just the blanket scene of like uh, Sokka puts the blanket on Katara, Zuko sees that and then tries to do the same with Azula, but gets distracted by the fact that the letter is there and so on. There's a lot of great moments, but any specific ones you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to see sort of the interactions with Ty Lee and Azula early on. I think those are interesting, just sort of, her fear or her not getting over the fear. I think it's interesting to see, just Ty Lee as sort of a Kyoshi warrior, her interacting with Suki, that little bit, I think it's interesting, and just having them in sort of the royal nation. I think, I don't know, I like to see, how that sort of stuff develops later on, especially with us talking about Azula for a good portion, just sort of how the future of that sort of, goes on. I think is one point that I really liked.
And then I suppose for me, I suppose let's get into the kind of big topic. Let's get into more of the stuff on Ursa herself. There's a lot of kind of key points to talk about. Of course, the relationship with Ikem earlier on, the fact that they actually get engaged, and that's almost like the day after. Like that's when they're found by Azulon and Ozai, and she's forced to save Ikam by having to agree and come across like she wanted this, and it sets this stage for what kind of ends up repeating over the course of Ursa's life. Of she's forced into these situations where she has to make these choices that she really has no choice in, like that she's forced into a choice that isn't really what she would go for herself to save someone else. So saving Ikem earlier on, having to get banished to save Zuko, and so it's all a setup for the moment where she finally makes a decision for herself, which is to forget her past life and have her happy moment finally with Ikam. And I've always felt that the book has done a great job at setting up that moment of like not taking away that like it's this, there is some negativity that you can have towards that decision, but you being able to understand why she makes it in that moment, why she chooses to have a happy life for herself over just always remembering just the kind of hopeless situation she was left in of like she knows Ozai is always watching her and that if she comes anywhere near the kids he'll hurt them, that she can't do anything except just stay away, never knowing what's really happening with them, and just always remembering, what could have been. I think they do a good job at like explaining why she would make that decision, why she acknowledges, I'm a terrible mother, as she accepts the decision to have something for herself at last, to have some happiness. And I've had this discussion with a bunch of people online about this, and it feels like there are definitely people out there who are very sort of in a way like completely unsympathetic towards Ursa, as if like there was something more Ursa could have done to show that she still cares in that moment, that she could have tried to get them back. When I think it's clear enough, like Ozai mentions multiple times that like he spies on her, he watches her, that even in like the final scene of the book, basically he says that I had you watched for months before we got married, so like before they even arrived to sort of basically take her. There, you really think there was like an opportunity for her to kind of organize something in some way, to spy on them from a distance and have him not know. I think it's the point of the scenes is to present Ursa as being put into this terrible situation, which she was put into to save Ikam, then Zuko. She did it all for other people, but she suffered the most, and she finally makes the decision for herself. I've always been able to like be like, I accept that they're willing to give her this sort of flawed decision, and I can understand exactly why she did it and not hate her for it. And you being able to sort of almost admire her for making that decision in some ways. And now she, as we go forward, can have that chance to sort of redeem herself from that, and that's key to Azul's arc and Ursa's arc going forward. So that's why I've always sort of disagreed with the idea of like when someone calls like Ursa a bad mother for big moments like this, it feels very sort of unsympathetic towards someone who had just a terrible life in so many ways. The way the decisions went for her were just so bad, and she just did everything she could to help everyone until she was finally presented with a situation where she couldn't help her kids. She just had to stay away and hope that things turned out the way they turned out. So, what are your thoughts on the key Ursa moments that we learn in this book?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's definitely an interesting way to go about it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it would, absolve her from getting sort of like the bad mother sort of like title there. I think there's definitely elements that can sort of sway yourself going to either sort of, side of the coin in that case. I think, with the choices that she was sort of, presented and sort of approached with, and just sort of like, the resources that she had versus what Ozai have, like, there's no comparison there, what he could have done versus what she could have done there. It's just, it doesn't, at least from what we've been presented so far, it doesn't seem like there's any real sort of, course of action that she could have taken, I guess sort of outright from the beginning that sort of would have, led things, going towards, her in sort of a favorable way without sort of like being something so extreme that would have ended in like martyrdom or something along those lines here. So I think, with the choices that she was presented with, saving Ekem initially from the initial sort of confrontation there to later on doing what she had to do to sort of, save Zuko and to sort of save herself in a way, just from that sort of, whole situation with what, Ozai was being sort of forced to do after his, actions there. It seems like she's tried to take sort of, I guess, sort of the lesser of, sort of two evils in most of these situations here until presented with the choice of, having to, choose for herself what to do here. And it's not like, it doesn't seem like she has, no regret over the situation that she's sort of, has had to make here versus like, Ozai, from what we've seen so far, he doesn't seem like, other than the fact that things didn't turn out the way that he wanted them to be, they're not, he doesn't really, he doesn't really care as along those lines versus, even, Ursa when she was Noriko and didn't really know the situation at hand, she still could feel, at the base level of her character that, she was flawed in some sort of way here. So it seems like, she has that, positive recourse as a character versus what we've seen in other ones here. So that's where I would lead as far as, her being a character. I mean, she's definitely, she's still flawed. I mean, that's sort of the whole, idea of the Avatar world or just, real life in general that, no one is going to be perfect in any sort of these situations. It's sort of how you're dealing with the hand that you have at the time and how even sort of after the fact, how you sort of deal with that. I mean, I think it'll be interesting, tell of how she wants to sort of deal with sort of, Azula later on and sort of that sort of fear and sort of, mistrust and animosity that's sort of going to come with that. But, it seems like even from that sort of perspective, she's willing to at least, start on the path of sort of, figuring out how to deal with things versus sort of, just sort of running away from the situation at hand. So, I mean, that's where I guess I would lead as towards as Ursa and her sort of big moments that, there are definitely some hard decisions that she had to make. And while she may not be, the best mother by any sort of regards here, she's still, trying to do, at least in the moment, what seems to be right. And I think, she's making strides towards that. I mean, there's still a lot more development that needs to be had there, which hopefully we'll get in sort of coming books here and just sort of her new, I guess, sort of family dynamic, which would be another interesting thing just to discuss in general how that's going to work out or how that could potentially work out overall.
Yeah, like I think the big takeaway from this book is just that like I appreciate it so much for really making Ursa a character, that she is flawed and you can debate her decisions in the same way that you can debate like Zuko's arc and his back and forths, his up and downs and Aang's back and forths, that Ursa has the same thing, and it's almost like some of the most interesting stuff to discuss because of, what it deals with. And I think there's just such a clear arc to it that I think it works out so nicely to have those discussions of just, do you blame her for that decision given the options that she had? In that, like, if she chose not to forget, like, would she not just have been like killed like the following week? Like that seems to be Ozai's kind of go-to, is just like, oh, I'll tell you I'll do this, but then I'll just send someone out to take you out the next time. That in choosing to forget, is that not the only reason she's actually still alive at this point? It's the only reason Nora and Ekem is still alive. And then there's always that point of just like, yeah, like, what was she meant to do? Like, is her just like existing, always remembering, but always out of reach? Like, is that the proof that she's like a good mother versus like making this decision for herself and so on? It's a super interesting one to debate, and I think probably one of the things I like the most about this book is as well that it's a very simple back and forth once like Ursa is back, when she gets her normal face back, and she says to Zuko, like, you must hate me. Like, what mother chooses to forget about, her son or her children? And Zuko's just like, everything turned out okay. You're here now, type thing. That he fundamentally didn't mind all that much, because I think he acknowledges that what happened to me it isn't to do with you. That given what happened, there wasn't anything you could do, and it's pretty much the same situation with Azula for the most part. That most of what the issues are between Azula and Ursa are not necessarily because of this decision to forget. It seems to be about kind of what happened before. So I like that there, for the most part, wasn't really any need for anything incredible between like Ursa and Zuko. It was just he's just happy that she's here. Like that's all he really wanted, and that when he realized earlier on in the book that Noriko was Ursa, he was perfectly fine to just back away, just happy knowing that she's alive, not wanting to like interrupt her life by revealing all of this stuff to her. And I think that really highlights the character that like Zuko has grown into since the start of the series. But what are your thoughts on some of those scenes that we get towards the end of like Zuko realizing Noriko is Ursa, and then the dynamic at the very end of the book when we get actual Ursa back?
Yeah, no, I think those were very sort of telling for Zuko and as a character, and just sort of, how he's, grown as a character, and how he, at this point, he would have been fine with, just like you mentioned, just sort of knowing that she's around, and sort of, knowing that things turned out for the better. I think, either way, Zuko would have been fine with the situation. There's still, Azula thrown into the mix, so that's always sort of going to complicate things, of course, as we saw eventually sort of happened here. But I think as far as, that sort of, interaction goes, it was very sort of telling as far as, just sort of their sort of dynamic that would have worked well. Even if she didn't get the memory, I think it would have been interesting and to see, and just sort of it would have worked out for the better. But I think the way that it did turn out with her sort of getting all her memories back and seeing, that sort of, resolution, at least somewhat a resolution of events there. I think it definitely, pushes things more forward than it would have, in any other sort of situation. Now there's just sort of the whole sort of dynamic that needs to be worked out as far as, things actually coming to some sort of, sense or beginning sense of closure.
And then, like you said earlier on, we now have this, like from the search onwards, we have this really unique dynamic of like a very different royal family of like we now have Ursa is back, but Noran is also there, Ikem is there. Like we haven't discussed Ki at all yet, that Ursa has this other daughter, like Zuko has a sister, Azula has a sister, and what she adds to the situation. Like I think I mentioned already the line of like Azula saying, "Oh, you had to have a new daughter to replace me," and stuff like that. But we also see that Zuko gets on really well with her, and it's part of the dynamic in like Smoke and Shadow, is that he's really close to Ki. And now that she's a firebender, it's going to be very interesting to see what path she goes on, and especially like I think one of my most interesting interactions is going to be like Azula and Ki. What is that dynamic like, given that Azula's going into this with the sort of like jealous of her, like this is the daughter you always wanted. Ki, I think, is just probably going to want to know who Azula is, get to know her, and then I think it's something that a lot of people are talking about, but I do want to see them use Noran as a character. I'd like to see him have a father-son talk with Zuko. I'd like to see what he would have to say to Azula. Those type of dynamics, like not have it just all be about Ursa and Azula, like include the whole family in this, and because I think there's a really good dynamic. I think at this point, I think most of the fandom really likes Ki, and especially in Smoke and Shadow when they kind of characterized her more. They want to know where her kind of arc goes, in the same way that we don't know where Azula goes, we don't know where Ki goes either. So What are your thoughts on this new extended royal family that we have?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a really cool sort of, plot point to sort of be thrown into the mix here. Just sort of, how, that whole, I guess sort of the whole sort of relation there, how, like you mentioned, how, Zuko gets on really well with Ki and just sort of, even before, he knew he was related to her directly, just sort of, you could tell that there is some sort of connection there just because Zuko, he generally has, especially now, he has a lot, kind of heart in general, so he's a lot more open to things. And, it makes you wonder how things would have turned out if him and Zula weren't, maybe so close in age or so competitive with, just sort of everything of being, as part of the royal, Fire Nation sort of family there. I think that itself probably had, a large bit of, pressure put on them to sort of, act in a certain way and develop as a certain way, which, Ki being, raised in this village up until this point, hasn't really had those sort of influences. So just seeing her sort of, adjust to this new dynamic of being, essentially royalty and being, another, person of importance or, at least, sort of honored in this sort of way here will be, really interesting to see how that plays out here. So no, I'm definitely curious to see how, this dynamic sort of works out, how, Ekem Norm is sort of, placed into this. I mean, he definitely he's going to have some sort of role in things. I mean, he's not really royalty in any sort of sense here or related directly. So, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, I definitely can see, from what the little bit that we've seen of him, which hasn't been, he hasn't really been overly sort of characterized yet. But you can definitely see him having a more sort of like patient, sort of understanding approach to things, more along the lines of Iroh without sort of like all the sort of Fire Nation sort of royalty sort of experience, but just sort of the little bits that we get of him sort of going through the whole experience of meeting the spirits and just sort of taking a step back of things and knowing pretty much from the beginning how things were probably going to turn out, and just him willing to go through with this definitely tells a lot about his character for the better. Just him willing to do this, knowing that his previous life up until this point, with Noriko, Ursa, is going to change, and probably not in sort of the more calmer, quieter way that he might have sort of imagined. But initially he didn't even know that he would even get Ursa back to begin with. So I think that's definitely shows a lot about his character that I think would be worth exploring later on.
Because I'm half thinking that like I'd really like them to do something different and maybe be like, okay, like Ursa and Azula begin to sort of connect, but that one of the big connections actually ends up being that like Azula and like Noran actually get on really well or something like that. That there's like a surprising dynamic that comes out of this whole situation with Azula, and not just immediately be the Ursa and Azula, have their big heart to heart and are back to being, the mother and daughter that you expect, but it's actually one of the other dynamics that actually is like the most important to Azula going forward. Like, especially if they bring back the whole Ozai thing into things, I think it would be interesting to be like, to have like a perspective of like, oh, so like this is what like an actual father is or something like that. Those type of dynamics I think would be interesting to like use your kind of newer characters. And then similarly, like you brought up Iroh, I'd like to see Iroh play a role with Azula as well, because in this book he obviously suggests that there's another character who will learn from this journey as well, referencing Azula, but we haven't really seen him talk about Azula that much. And I'd like to see what his take on her is, given that he focused so much on Zuko. How does he really feel about Azula? Because everyone brings up the whole, she's crazy and needs to go down line and stuff like that. But now, how does he actually feel about her? But I think one of the few topics left is they use the symbolism of the masks and love amongst the dragons quite well in this book to kind of really represent, I think, so much of like, okay, this explains the masks in an even deeper way than we thought about before. That that I think throwaway line of like, oh, our mother brought us to these kind of plays, Ember Island Players and stuff like this, Love Amongst the Dragons, is now this actually important thing of like Ursa was super into theater and actually was an actor and stuff like that, and so was Ekam, and we get explained like a little bit of the plot of that movie, of that play, and the Blue Spirit mask is actually sort of the villain of that play, and that was the one Zuko was always forced to wear. And Azula was always had to be the sort of hero character, and that represents sort of their dynamic. And it's one of the few times in this book where Azula and Zuko sort of talk about their sort of friendlier like childhood together. And I think that works so nicely because like they have some of the lines of dialogue being like, you know, the like in even though like you were in a different form, like I knew it was you, that sort of thing. Like it, the lines from that play kind of represent what the actual plot is about, and that's pretty nicely done. So, what were your thoughts about how they used Love Amongst the Dragons as like a theme in the book?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely was a nice touch as far as just sort of being something that Ursa holds dear to her heart from, her pastime sort of growing up and being an actress to sort of, that sort of integrating with, Azula and Zuko and sort of their sort of, being actually, brought to those plays and sort of, just sort of the idea of the mask in general, just sort of, just the whole idea of the faces and sort of that being your true sort of face versus what you're actually sort of hiding underneath, I think is something that, the whole book, wove together really well. I mean, just the idea of there being, a spirit called the Mother of Faces and how, that plays out and just sort of the visual elements that you see there of just sort of all the faces, the mask sort of in the water and how that's sort of like her thing to sort of sculpt on the people and just sort of, even how that, relates back to Ko and stealing faces. I think, that thread line, I think, is one of the strong points that they use to connect the story with the original series and just sort of, push things even farther. I think that was definitely one of the coolest parts of this book. And it's not sort of like, overall thrown sort of like in your face per se, but it's, it's a nice touch that's there that, has relevance and, definitely, it adds to another level of just sort of, I guess, the general sort of world building of, this sort of story that I think is definitely well appreciated.
Yeah, 'cause especially just to the whole Zuko Blue Spirit character, the idea that effectively, like, he took that as like a brother representation of like, okay, it represents something to his mother, but also the character that like the Blue Spirit kind of represents like Zuko's kind of lowest moments in a way of like what he kind of resorts to when he is so desperate, that it's the kind of loser character from the play that he was always forced to play as, whereas like his actual true potential is more like the hero of that play rather than the kind of villain who always loses in the play. It's just a fun approach of just he takes that symbol of like this kind of failure to be his alter ego. So that was pretty cool. But do you have any final points about the search?
No, I think I'm all out on the ones I had listed at least.
Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much been our discussion on the search then, man. Like going through it again, like it's just got so much depth to it. Like you compare what we discussed here to say our discussions as like Imbalance came to an end and stuff like that. It's so very different in terms of just the approach to everything. I think the depth with which they covered the topics, the importance of the topics. This is why these earlier comics I think are so important, because they take risks with some of the characters. Like I think it was a risk in this book to give Ursa an arc like that, to have her go through these very flawed moments and do so much in a way with her. Similarly with like Azula, really developing her character here by committing to a character arc for her, whereas in Balance it really feels like they were almost afraid to do anything with any of the characters, and all they really had was like the villain is doing some stuff, and Rue has a little bit of an arc, and that's kind of really about it. It was just time with the characters, and you compare that to The Promise, you compare that to this, The Rift, Smoke and Shadow. Like things have kind of changed a little bit, and that's why the next comic needs to deliver, because this one just highlights so much of what the comics can be, of like good use of like the main characters, even though like Aang, Sokka, Katara aren't the main focus. They play a good support role of like Aang sort of helps Zuko to deal with the big reveal he goes through, and then it goes back on that. The rest of the team is mainly there for backup, but it made sense to have the team there for security with Azula. You have Azula's dynamic with the group to be the unique thing, but then the importance of like the Ursa backstory, the focus on Azula, the focus on Zuko himself, plus a lot of the other more minor stuff with like Iroh, Suki, Ty Lee. It doesn't feel like it really wastes its time, and even the later plot points that they introduce, like the Misu and Rafa thing, it's actually very interesting and fits the themes of the book and adds a nice layer to it, because you've got the plot with the Mother of Faces, who's not just there to just be the plot point for how Azula was missing and now is back, but also plays into like spiritual humanity, stuff like that. So it's like it's so kind of broad in scope in a way what it covers, whereas the other books have been of late very focused and not in depth. So the exact opposites of what this is doing. But what are your final thoughts on The Search?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely, overall, The Search has, like you mentioned, it has a lot of depth to it. It has a lot of connections with the original story, which helps it sort of push things past. I think, it being one of the most talked about sort of points of the original series definitely helps it, but I think it adds, enough more to just the world in general, just sort of the idea of the spirits, and just sort of with their family dynamics, that is probably one of the things that, has had the sort of biggest sort of, overall plot points that can sort of keep, these series of comics sort of going, at least as far as, what we have in this current sort of, I guess, sort of like timeline of the ages of our current characters here without pushing them forward. I think it definitely has the potential, if there were to be more stories done along these sort of lines, that I think it would be worth it for them to continue the stories that come sort of out of this book, just because they seem to have a lot more meaning than maybe some of the stuff that we've seen recently in current comics here. But no, I think it's definitely one of the better or best sort of, series of these comics that is definitely worth sort of checking out for anyone who's, wanted to know what happened.
Yeah, like, that's the thing with this book, is that, like, whenever anyone gets, like, recommended, like, stuff, like, everyone would say, like, read The Search, but the other comics are good too. Like, it's always sort of highlighted above even the rest of the comics, and I think that's really telling, because I think just everyone can acknowledge just the sheer importance of this story. But it's also like, I think The Promise does some character stuff just as well as this, like with what it did with Aang and Zuko. That was sort of a risky move to have, like, within the first couple of pages, have like Zuko agree to this idea of like, Aang, will you kill me if I go bad? That's a risky move to have that happen that early on, but it worked. It just feels like some of the recent stuff, they've been very unwilling to do different things with the characters. But yeah, that's been our review of The Search, and we'll of course be continuing on our comic look back series. We're going on to The Rift next, which should be pretty exciting, another very good series. And yeah, in terms of the next podcast, pretty much, whenever there's some news, like we're waiting for news, of course. In about a month, we'll have Runes of the Empire Part 3, so that review will be coming up, of course. That's going to be pretty exciting. And then, yeah, the big comic announcement. So, the Rift review may not be the next podcast, but it's definitely coming up. So look out for that. But yeah, other than that, that's been the podcast for today. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening. and bye.
Bye bye.